Baker at Firestorm. We're glad to have you with us today at this webinar that is co-sponsored by the Rochester Business Alliance. Our speaker today is going to be Jim Satterfield, who is the president of Firestorm. Chip Dawson is today's moderator. He's with the Rochester Business Alliance. Chip, would you want to say anything to introduce us immediately?
Absolutely, Bill. I've got just a couple of thoughts for you, and I'd like to say good morning to everyone that's attending, and welcome to the third in the series of the Crisis Coach. The Rochester Business Alliance is delighted to partner with Firestorm to bring you, our members, this fascinating hour-long discussion by Jim Satterfield, one of the country's top crisis managers. And it's covering another topic, critical to effective emergency management and business continuity. We're pleased that you've returned to the series or joined us for the first time. The Rochester Business Alliance is committed to strong ongoing support for our members as they deal with the issues of running an effective organization. We also recognize that both internal errors and external forces may disrupt your daily routine, and that's where the briefing Jim will provide today will prove valuable. While you do not always control the forces impacting your operation, you do influence most of them, and that's where the Rochester Business Alliance comes in. We provide the tools and training you need to keep people safe and your operation running smoothly. Whether it's practical training for your people, coaching for managers, or assessment and strategic planning support for the operation, the RBA can help you take the steps necessary to prevent the crisis and lessen the impact. As you listen to Jim today, think about the actions you might take to avoid getting into a crisis situation. And when the program is over, contact us to talk about how we might help you with those actions. So with our best wishes for a safe and happy holiday season, here's Jim or Bill, whichever one comes up first.
Thank you, Chip. A few items of business that we need to cover. As always, we do have this on the hashtag Crisis Coach. Please also feel free to join us at Firestorm Solutions as one of our Facebook friends, or join us on Twitter. Firestorm transfers crisis into value, and we empower you, the business owner, business manager, to manage risk and crises. Firestorm has expertise in crisis management, crisis communication, public relations, consequence management. Our motto is predict, plan, perform. Our lawyers make us say that this presentation is not complete without the accompanying oral comments and discussion. Work products provided by Firestorm must be read in conjunction with all guidance given by national, regional, local authorities, as well as your company's or your organization's personal counsel. This information should not be viewed as legal advice or legal opinion. The Rochester Business Alliance is pleased to be the co-sponsor of the Crisis Coach webinar. Today we'll be discussing time when it matters most. Watch for future webinars, and past webinars are online at firestorm.com/RBA. This webinar will in fact be posted for your review and the review of others on that same website. And as I mentioned, Rochester Business Alliance is the co-sponsor in underwriting this particular presentation. Our presenter today is the President, Chief Operating Officer, and co-founder of Firestorm, Jim Satterfield. Jim has extensive experience in emergency preparation, emergency communications, and has a lot of familiarity with your part of the world there. He served a number of years in Buffalo. Jim, on to you.
Thanks, Chip, and thanks, Bill. Glad to speak with everybody today as we focus on this subject of time. As we do each time when we talk about what's happening, it's always good to see what's been in the news that relates to this business continuity, crisis management, and emergency response area. Obviously, we had a report of a fire and explosion in a nuclear power plant this past week. Certainly raises the concerns and memories of Chernobyl and 3 Mile Island and those levels of concern. Fortunately, this one was under control. We've seen lives saved as a result of various phone calls from campuses. There was a story out of New Haven this week where the phone call, the alert, knowing what to do, who to call made a difference. Compare that to just a few weeks ago in Colorado in Jefferson County schools, where a student reported to the teacher they saw an armed person on campus. The teacher became so upset that she could not remember the number to call, and time was lost in that area. Turned out there was not an armed intruder, but the number obviously was 911. In a crisis, when time really matters most, and the topic we're going to talk about today, knowing what to do and, more importantly, how to do it makes a big difference. The train derailment that we saw across all of the news is a function of sleep deprivation, as we've seen reported in the media, and looking at that, and that impacts all of us as the drivers on the road, the conditions that are there, the operators of equipment and machinery make a large difference in being able to carry forward. We had a meningitis outbreak at Princeton and another one in San Diego at a different college. Communicable illness is an issue that we don't talk a lot about, and we tend to focus on the pandemic threats like the swine flu from a few years ago. But you need to look at communicable illness as a major threat and exposure that you want to make sure that your plans are updated for to be ready. We'll do a webinar sometime in 2014 on that topic and share some insights in it. We did a couple of test exercises over the last few weeks, one for a large bank in the Northeast and another for a major insurance company. And we got an article shared back from the insurance company after the exercise as we were going through and following in that area that a pandemic is viewed as by the National Association of Insurance Commissioners as the #1 threat that insurance companies face and that they need to become prepared for. Winter storms, we've seen a cycle. We've had 5 storms over the last 5 weeks, another one coming in over this weekend. We've seen clearly impacts associated with that. When you talk about the Eastern Great Lakes area and what you're doing in Rochester, you certainly are veterans of that level of exposure and the outages that would be there. One additional item that's not up on the list is something that's been in the news heavily in the last 24 hours, and that's the interpreter at the services for Mandela in South Africa. And the fact that the interpreter was making up the signage as he was going through the process and had schizophrenia and other types of problems. Think about having that background, which was known, and having that individual standing next to world leaders. President Obama was there with this person literally inches away. Knowing and predicting and planning are a key difference, and I'm sure there will be a lot of discussions within the Secret Service and the other groups that protect world leaders as a result of how was this individual with that background able to get to that point to literally be inches away from the President of the United States. So when you think about your particular business, think about what the exposures and vulnerabilities are. How are you monitoring them? What are the triggers to know? Because that's a risk that could have been 100% prevented from ever occurring had the right steps been taken and followed at those points. And we'll talk about that as we go through. Leading into the discussion of a crisis, we've shared with you many of the things that happen in a crisis, the escalation of events, the loss of command and control, the emphasis on the fact that every crisis is a human crisis. I received a phone call last week from one of our groups that we work with in San Francisco, a firm, and he was calling to tell me that the crisis management plan worked. And that's always bad news. When it means the crisis management plan worked, it means that there was a crisis and a problem. They had what we all were concerned about, the death of an employee. And he was calling to say that the plan that we put into place and worked on together worked exactly as it was supposed to. The right decisions were made, the right escalations, the right communications in resolving that, because obviously when you have an employee die in the workplace, that really emphasizes that line that you see in front of you, that every crisis is a human crisis. The other aspect to talk about off this page is that last word, surprise. I normally tell everyone that the last time a surprise was good, I was 5, and it was my birthday. If you're at work and there's a surprise, like the example that I just gave with the employee death, that's certainly not good news. It's certainly a problem that's going to come together. And you want to know what it is you're supposed to do and how you're supposed to do it. The what and the how will be an element that we'll continually talk about in all of our series. The most common failure that we find when we review plans is that where they are good enough to tell somebody what to do, they are not good enough to tell someone how to do it. So I'd like you to go back and look at the plans within your company and say, if I read that, would I know how to do it as an employee, as a manager, and in my role? So Bill, at the opening of the webinar today, talked about the words that you see on the screen: predict, plan, perform. Predict what the vulnerabilities and threats are. What are their impacts? How do you monitor them? What are the triggers? Now, that's important for you to do when we're dealing with a crisis and when time is going to matter the most, to predict what the impacts are, what's going to happen next, to start to monitor this, and then having a defined trigger that's going to tell you how to move forward to go from that standpoint. Clearly, you need plans, the policies, the procedures to make sure that all those things are in place, and then you have to execute on them. But this is a continual loop here as you're monitoring as those events come together and look at it. So when we think about all the plans, and at the very beginning, Chip did a great job of putting those in perspective, I think, for everyone today and talking about it. But when you look at all of these words that relate to business continuity, they also relate to time management. This is, when we think about a business continuity plan, when we think about a crisis management plan, when we think about a workplace violence plan, we think about time management. What do we need to do, and when do we need to do it as we carry through it? Now, you've got a lot of words buried on this slide: recovery, response, identification, guest. Who are the visitors on your property? What is going to be happening there? Weaknesses, demonstrate, predetermined, actions, preparedness. All of these elements are coming together to take a look at that. Now, when we look at the 5 stages in terms of doing planning, and we'll touch those in a while, but they go pre-action, onset, impact assessment, response and recovery, and then finally consequence management in the post area. In this pre-action mode, like we are today in our webinar, you're not in a crisis in your business today. There's not anything that's bad that's happened yet. We use this tool. It's a calendar. We have the luxury of all the time in the world to move forward. But as the slide automatically jumps to the next, once there's onset, once that event occurs, we move to a different tool. And shown here is a watch, because now it's a matter of seconds and minutes to be able to carry that forward. That's when the time matters most, is right at the point of onset and impact assessment and recovery. That's the point that we want to focus on with all of our plans, making sure that we have clear roles, clear responsibilities, and that our people have the tools and supplies that they need to carry that forward. You're in an environment in the greater Rochester area in western New York. As you look at that winter storms could certainly have an impact. Roads could be closed. You may have to shelter in place for an extended period. If you haven't looked at your supply needs, let us know, and we can help you with that. There's a firm that we work with called Nexus, and they have developed, along standards and best practices, an assessment tool that would help you determine what kind of supplies do you need and in what quantity for your particular business. But that's only one element associated with it. So when we think about this concept of the time machine here, if there is something going on and there's confusion, that's going to cost you time. If it delays the response, it's going to make a significant impact. So your plans become your time machine. Your plans tell you this is what needs to be done. There's no wasted time trying to figure out the next steps. You ought to be able to immediately open them up and they'll step you through exactly how you would go about doing an impact assessment, or getting your people to lock down or to evacuate, and carrying forward in those particular areas. So what the plans do literally are buy you time. This time machine, unfortunately, only moves forward. It doesn't move back. When you think about it, the clock is ticking. You've got that impact that's occurring, and every time you miss a beat, something else is happening. Something else is occurring with your people, and the impact on your business continues to grow. So our plan is designed to buy that time for you. The fourth line down, when seconds matter, the police will arrive in minutes. What we could say the fire department or the paramedics or whatever the support function comes in. We're very blessed to be in America to have first responders that run toward the gunfire or run toward the burning building or run toward the accident to help in those particular areas. That line that you see there was given to us by our Chief Security Officer, who's a retired Secret Service agent, and he's the one that stated that when seconds really matter, the police will arrive in minutes. You're looking to buy time with your plans. You're also looking to reduce time that it takes to recover, to get your business back up and running. That's the true value. That's the return on investment associated with your plans so that you're coming together. Identifying what the risks are. You need to know, what are we going to be concerned about? What are the vulnerabilities? What are your threats? Developing the plans, understanding how we're going to mitigate those impacts associated with our people. Training them, and you'd be surprised as we do the assessments on companies, how many companies haven't trained or exercised their plans to understand what the impacts are and the steps that they need to take. And by doing all of that and having that in place, it's going to buy you the time. It'll shorten the response that's coming together. It'll make sure your people get out of the building or get the doors locked and as they go into lockdown or sheltering in place. And it's going to buy you that time when it matters the most. When it means the most and when people need it the most, that's where your plans come in and work in those particular directions. I've spent a career in the insurance and reinsurance industry, and reinsurers insure insurance companies. And as you go around and meet with them at the end of the year, you would hear these companies say, you know, we had a great year. Everything happened the way that we anticipated, except for, and then they would talk about an event. They'd talk about some risk that would have occurred. Now, they were treating those risks as if they were black swans, events that had never occurred before, but in fact they were elephants. They were things that were predictable. We know that we're going to have hurricanes. We had a very mild hurricane season this year, but the year before we had Hurricane Sandy, and look at the damage that was done in the New Jersey area and New York and Connecticut and Rhode Island as a result of that particular storm. So if you find yourself after a crisis saying, if only we had done this, except for this, we hear that after every crisis. Those two phrases are the most common, and that's the real reason you want to have your plans in place. Because going back to the statement that every crisis is a human crisis, you don't want to be in a position where you're making that phone call to a family member and say, you know, I'm sorry your husband or your wife won't be coming home from work today because this happened. You want to make sure that you have done everything so there's not an if only or an except for that comes out. Now, in a crisis, we know that if you're explaining, you're losing. If you're talking about, well, we did this and this is what happened and how it came to be, you're going to be losing in that scenario. And it's not going to help in that particular response. So I would like you to ask yourself these 5 questions, and they are going to be the key to taking a look at your planning. Do your employees know what to do and how to do what you need them to do? That's a cumbersome sentence. Probably I need to go back and take an English course around it. But many times employees don't know what to do, and most of the time they don't know how to do it. And when you hear words like, well, I think I know, that means you don't. Or I read that somewhere, it means they don't have it available to them. It needs to be simple, and it needs to be available to them instantaneously. It doesn't need to be in a binder that's out of date on a shelf. It needs to be available to them on their smartphone, on their laptop, on their computer, or in a brochure. It needs to have the information they need right at that point in time. Second, are your plans customized for your company or based on a copy of someone else's plan? I met with a group of senior leaders within a school, and they said, well, could you just give us somebody else's plan and we'll change the name? Well, the exposures would be completely different from one school to another. Some of the factors might be there, but how you would handle it in a different location, one from another. So there's no such thing as a cookie-cutter plan, one size that fits all, because the operations are different, the exposures are different, the resources are different as you go through. Are your plans accurate, and are they up to date? When BP responded to the spill in the Gulf, they went to activate their crisis management plan, and the person who had been in charge had been dead for 5 years. Well, I don't think that guy's going to be a lot of help to you if, unless you're planning to add a psychic to your crisis management team. So looking at those things, making sure you have the right call numbers, the right processes. Oh, we added a new operation. We did an addition to the building. We changed departments. We changed the control and flow. We have different people and different assignments. If that plan isn't current, if it's not up to date, then it's not going to be clearly helping you at this point. And having access, as I said just at the beginning of these, does everybody have it? Do they have it at home? Do they have it while they're driving home today from work? Do they have it while they are at work? And do your plans align with standards and best practices? There are very clear standards and best practices for each of the areas that we're talking about. Business continuity, workplace violence, communicable illness, social media risk. All of those become really very critical as we're moving forward. So we go beyond now asking yourself these questions. The next question I want you to think about is, where is your plan? Is it in a binder? Is it on a shelf? Is it on a computer? If you don't have electricity, you can't get there. You know, different things that are happening when that thing starts to occur and people are running out the door. There's a lot of questions that start to come up that need to be answered. And you can't expect everyone to remember everything that's there. So the plan clearly needs to be written. If your plan is only in a binder, then you don't have the tools that you need when you need them as you go forward. So I'd like you to think about your plans, where they are, not only for you, but for everyone within your organization. How do they access them? How will they get that information? Are they correct, and are they up to date? Now, in talking about those three words, time, access, and accuracy, those are words that we really need to focus on, because if it's going to take you time to locate the plan, then that's time that's lost, and that clock is running. Again, the snapping as that clock continues to advance. That time is wasted, means that bad things are occurring, and you're not beginning to mitigate. You're not protecting your people. Those elements continue to go forward as they have there. Access, does everybody who needs to see the plan have access to their role within it? Do they have access not only to the primary decision makers, but the backups? As we talk about all of these areas, you must be 3 people deep. That's called HR rule 1, 2, 3. For every critical function, there needs to be 3 people trained in it, the primary and 2 backups, because the primary could be involved in whatever occurred. The primary could be off today or on vacation or homesick. So you need to have all of the individuals having the access, having the training, and knowing what needs to be there and to be done. And that last word, they need to be accurate. You need to be telling the people exactly what you want them to do and have those activities coming together. And they become very complex depending upon the type of business crisis that we're dealing with. Now, when we think about business crisis, and up on the screen now you'll see a business crisis map, and I want to talk a little bit about this slide as a different way for you to begin to think about your business continuity, your crisis management, and the other plans that we looked at. Now, on the vertical axis, we move from before a crisis occurs, that's the pre-crisis, all the way to an active crisis being engaged. The left-hand side of the screen are a crisis that's very targeted. The right-hand one is more complex, affecting multiple functions or impacts or areas within your business. The majority of time, we are talking about that blue quadrant in the upper left-hand side. Now, quite frankly, this is one of the easier ones for us to deal with. This is an acute business crisis. There's an overwhelming event. That's the hurricane, it's the tornado, it's the fire, it's the active shooter. There's confusion, there's significant severity impact on the business, there's a cascading of events, things are happening very quickly, there's unclear path to recovery, how are we going to get our operation back up after that has occurred, and speed is quality. This is one where that time really matters because we've had a significant event that's targeted our company or a portion of it in a particular way to go forward. So all the meetings that you've ever attended where people have talked about business continuity and crisis management, the majority of time they're only talking about that blue quadrant, the active crisis that's occurring. How do we communicate? How do we respond? How do we recover within those areas? Environmental health and safety play within that quadrant. The quadrant immediately below, while it's still targeted, is before it's into a full-blown crisis. This is a difficult business crisis. There's an event or a series of events that have occurred. They cause disruption in performance. There's a failure to communicate to the appropriate members that are included. Business processes and control failures will become chronic if ignored. This could be a supply chain failure, for example, could occur in this particular area. Some aspect of it is occurring, and the processes that you have in place to deal with it are not necessarily there. Now, if we want to stay on the supply chain side just for a moment, we might be thinking about, have you identified your critical suppliers? Have you looked at those critical suppliers' business continuity plans? What metrics did you use to look at those? Because these are the areas, this is why management has a job. Something has happened that's different than what you'd anticipated, and you must deal with it. If you don't, this can escalate all the way up to an acute business crisis or move over into that chronic area, so this is a recurring problem within the business. Now let's think about that kind of orange-red in the upper right-hand corner here. This is a severe business crisis, so it's an active crisis, but it's very complex. It's got a lot of factors associated with it, where in the blue quadrant, it's the tornado that hit the warehouse. Here it's more complex. It's impacting multiple areas within the business. There's long-term significant problems now threaten the business as a going concern. Is our business going to survive? Radical quick action is necessary for the business to survive. You may have to do liquidation of assets, do layoffs. These could be symptoms of this quadrant. And finally, the business is may be controlled by a third party. Maybe the regulator is stepping in. If you're in the financial area, maybe the Federal Reserve or the FDIC or the state banking regulators. If you're in the insurance business, maybe the state insurance commissioner is there, or maybe the bank is calling the line of credit because of the cash flow within the business. Or maybe you're at a point where you're close to bankruptcy and you're dealing with the courts and dealing with those particular areas. So the problems have escalated. They're very complex. They're fundamentally integrated within the business and looking at those areas. And if you're talking about in your career, if you're in the area of dealing with business continuity, this is part of how you become more strategic within the business in helping to identify what's our decision process and how to go forward with it. We're working with a large bank in the Northeast, and they used their crisis management plan during the government shutdown to help them manage through and make all of those decisions that were associated with it. Again, the decisions were being made outside of the bank. that directly impacted the bank by the government with the shutdown, but things like small business loans couldn't be closed. And the political and brand and reputational impact of that certainly became an area. And the most dangerous quadrant is the one in the bottom right. That's where there's a chronic business crisis. Long-term systemic issues are apparent. Inefficient processes have eroded the business foundation over time. Maybe there's an aging of accounts receivable within this area. There's poor metrics to fail to detect the problem. And there's a gradual deterioration on many fronts, and it leads to chronic business crisis and ultimate failure. In that quadrant, the company is in trouble and isn't aware that's occurring. And it ties all of those elements together. So the difficult can move over laterally very easily to become chronic. So that's why being aware of each of these, looking at your plans and making sure that there's going to be a difference, these all play into the element of time that we've been discussing today. So time, access, and accuracy are different as you look at each one of those quadrants in your plans and seeing how they are addressed. Now, when we talk about crisis management, and I think I've shared this slide with you before, but it talks about what are the questions that people are asking at each point. We're trying to make this thing more dynamic, more being able to respond. And you take different questions and different actions at each one of the 5 stages: pre-action, onset, impact assessment, response and recovery, and consequence management. In this pre-action, before the event ever occurs, what should we know? What should we know about our vendors? What should we know as the employees are being trained? What should we know about our planning? Have we done all of those areas? Because we have here that calendar that we showed on an earlier slide. You have the luxury of all those events. Once the event occurs and we're in that onset and impact assessment, things are going to be moving very, very quickly. This is where you're in that area where seconds really matter. And having the process of what supplies do we need, where should we go, what should we do, all of those areas come into play within it. And as you're doing the assessment of the impact, if it's not major, you're going to stand down. You're going to continue on. But if it is going to be a significant impact, then you're declaring a crisis, you're moving forward, and you start to do the items that you see listed under the response and recovery as you move through each of those. So from the time the event occurred to the time that you've recovered, that's where we talk about the recovery time objective. So what are your priorities? What are your interdependencies? Who does each department depend on internally? Who are the critical vendors and suppliers that you depend on externally? What are the critical applications that we have to have up and running to get the information within our company to understand? Because if you're trying to make these decisions and you don't have access to the information, then it's going to slow that process down and it's going to take longer. So when time matters most, it's important that you know the order, the priority, and the dependencies of all of those elements coming together. And then afterwards, we still have areas. What should we do now that this has occurred? What should we be saying now? What should we be saying to our employees? Are they going to keep their job? Because they're going to be concerned about that. The statistics nationally, if there's a disaster or a crisis, is that 45% of the businesses that are struck, 40% of the businesses that are struck by a disaster never reopen. And of those that do, 25% fail within 2 years. That's a 55% failure rate. So employees are concerned not only for the company, but for their own paycheck, for their own family, as these elements are starting to come together as we're focused on it. So think about all of these in terms of your plan and what you have in place. So now let's shift over. What now? Is your plan static or is it dynamic? Static is, well, this is the only thing we're going to do. Does it have a process that lets you understand how you modify the plan, how you get the information, how is that information shared one within each of those areas? What should we know? What do we know? What should we do? What should we say? Where should we go? What supplies are needed? Those are things that you want to address and recognize that, hey, if we lose our building, we're not going to be able to go and have an EOC, an Emergency Operations Center, in the main conference room. If our building is not habitable, what's our next plan? Have we worked with a company in the area to say if something happens to us, we'd like to at least be able to convene our operations center at your location, and we'll reciprocate. You could come to us. Have you done a relationship with somebody like Regis, where their office space can be viewed as dynamic recovery, that you could at least go there and get your business up and running and started within the process? What are the supplies that are needed? All of those elements make this dynamic, because you've got to assume that if we lose our base, if we lose our current location, how are we going to operate? Now look at the questions down below. Is your plan current? Is it up to date? There's a maintenance schedule and plans. I looked at plans for a pharmaceutical company as we were doing an exercise, and they had been bought by another company, and in some places it included the name of the current company. Some places it included the name of the former company, and there are different communications channels, as you could imagine, associated with that. So you should be updating certain portions of your plan quarterly, call list, emails, telephone numbers, those types of things. Some more of an annual basis, looking at your vulnerabilities and threats, and some once every 3 years, going back to square one. Let's do a full vulnerability threat assessment. Let's do a revised business impact analysis, because our business process is clear. Is your plan easy to use? I picked up a plan and there were no tabs in it. It didn't have a clear table of contents. So time was being lost as people were trying to flip through and come to there. I would recommend that you take a table of contents approach with your plans, so it's very critical when someone's under stress that they can find immediately where they need to go and what they need to do at that point in time as they go through that table of contents and carry those elements together. Is it available to everybody 24/7? So is it online? Is it stored as PDF so that they can have access to it on their tablet, on their smartphone, on their laptop? Have you trained everyone? Have you tested it? So if you can answer all of these questions positively, then you know what? There's a pretty good chance that the things that you think are going to occur are going to occur. If you can't answer all of these questions positively, then more than likely your plan is static, not current, not easy to use, not available, not trained, not tested, doesn't have the supplies, and you're going to be in a situation where you're going to be saying, you know, if only we had done this, we would carry forward. So preparedness, and that's a word that you might want to start thinking about and using as we talk about this, integrates everything that you see on the screen. And you need plans in each of the areas that are listed there, no matter what business that you're in. Business continuity, how are we going to get our business back up and running if something were to occur? Communicable illness, it could be the meningitis that we just talked about that's occurring, or the whooping cough that impacted an organization in Texas this year. We've seen that chicken pox is making a resurgence, and when it affects adults, it has a significantly higher impact. The H5N1 is still there. There are a couple of new flus that are going through Singapore and Hong Kong now that could certainly have an impact on your business. And so if you don't have a current communicable illness plan, you're not going to have the outcomes that you're looking for. Now, the communicable illness plan is based upon the business continuity framework. So there's the structure, the decisions, the operational areas are there, and so that's why you see in the headline on this slide that has to integrate and manage those particular areas. Communications, what are your 3 key messages to each stakeholder group for each vulnerability and threat? And you want to have those messages planned and available online, as you see here in the example with the gentleman holding the tablet, or on your system, so that they know what to say, because it's easier to edit than it is to create as we go through those elements. Crisis management, how do you make decisions? Has that been identified? Is there clear lines of authority? Is the structure team in place to do it? Have you identified your subject matter experts Again, trying to find those people in the middle of crisis will again cost you time when you need it the most. Disaster recovery is generally an IT term, talking about getting your data and information. We're all now tied to having that data and having that information to make those decisions together. And if there's a discrepancy between what the IT and technology side of your house is looking at, if they're looking at getting systems up within 48 hours and you're looking that you need to have that information in 4 hours, there's a significant gap there as it would occur. Are you in the cloud? Is your information virtual? Is it replicated at multiple locations? If everything is at your location, now you're dealing with a single point of failure, and that would have a significant impact. Emergency response, we're generally looking at life, health, and safety here, the evacuations, the shelter in place, and getting the response. Notification. How are you telling your people? How are you telling them if the event occurs at night not to come in tomorrow? How are you getting information from them that they've been able to evacuate safely and together? The reunification plans in this whole area of family support systems, because unfortunately, since every one of these crises is a human crisis, being able to deal with how you unify your employees with their families or your customers with their families or the community in which you're in. Remember the explosion at the fertilizer plant this last year in Texas and the impact associated with that, or what we're seeing relived on the screen with the Sandy Hook shootings and how you match the families back with their children and how you separate those where the children have been hurt or killed and the families. Thinking through those now when it's not under stress becomes very critical. The security, the social media risk. The social media risk is the fastest growing risk that you're faced today in your company. And we're now seeing regulators requiring you to have a social media risk program in place and requiring your board or your senior management having responsibility for oversight of monitoring. Now, if you don't understand what that means, that's an area that we need to be talking about. And again, next year we'll do a webinar just on that subject. Because now, when time matters most, years ago when we would think about a crisis, we would talk about the golden hour. That's that hour in which you could check with your legal department, your public relations, your investor relations, your insurance company, your senior management before you made decisions or made communications. But today, that word is out instantly. It's being posted on Facebook. There's tweets going out of it. It's up on YouTube. Pictures are being shared. Videos being shared. Communications are coming out, and there's an instantaneous brand and reputation impact. And that's when the time is going to matter the most associated with it, so that you need to know what's being said and done. And clearly in a workplace violence period, you need to have that structure in place. Are you identifying the threats? Are you identifying the people that are at risk, whether you've seen a change in behavior on it? How is that being communicated? How is it being managed? So in managing that, as we would have 5 or 10 years ago with paper plans, or a complex system that requires special training to do it that costs a lot of money, you need to have it on a much simpler basis to be able to maintain and do that. Now here's a cleaner chart than the one that you saw earlier on crisis management. But it takes those same 5 stages and it shows you where some of the plans interface directly within that process. I would encourage you to think about what you have now and think about how those elements come together at each stage of the escalation, because that event occurs and we immediately move from the calendar and pre-action to the watch and that sweep second hand that's going around at onset and impact assessment to know what we have to activate, what we have to do. The survivability, that was hard for me to say today as we were talking about it, of your company hangs in that balance. Because if you wait too long to respond, the company may not recover. If you look at the impacts that are there, you have to have them identified to respond during each one of these stages of escalation as we go forward. Now, we talked some about crisis communications earlier, but let's go back. Look at this fact now, all the different ways that you're seeing it go out. through the internet, via satellites, communications literally with email messages or tweets or text messages that are going around. Certainly it will be in a newspaper, it will be carried forward, and don't underestimate the impact of the newspaper on a local market level. Also, if you've had a problem within your business and you start seeing it in the national media, if it's being picked up by the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, now that changes the elements because it adds credibility associated with it. Phone communications, whether it's cellular or landline and going forward. It's not going to be, as we've seen in the past, that press conference up in the upper right-hand corner and talking. That microphone is going to be much broader, and it's going to be controlled by third parties as that information starts to unfold and go back out. So analyzing a situation and tying it together, those are going to be the elements that you need to think about, because when we think specifically about time, and when it's the most critical, when it matters the most, this whole area of crisis communications, how do I get the messages to my employees? How do I communicate with them? How do I get the message to my customers, to my vendors, to my regulators? What are those messages? What are the modes of communications, the medium within it? Is it one-directional communication, or is it two-directional communication, so it's coming back? This whole area of crisis communications also can be linked into the area of situational awareness, because in many cases we're going to learn more about it from what's being said by others, and that'll be indicators that we go forward. So I wanted to single out a couple of these areas where time really is going to be the key elements in it. So we've talked about crisis communications. We've talked about social media risk, the fact that you now are required to have plans and programs in it. The regulators are looking at it. I talked with a group of auditors the other day, and they're auditing what a company is doing in those areas and how they're managing that and identifying it. And doing the monitoring is more than just a Google search. It's getting the correct monitoring tool or service in place, providing the reports that not only give you the metrics, but linkage to the specific comments and giving you that content, as well as the analysis of the tone and the message and the impact associated with it. Communicable illness, because it's going to be the radical shifting, because every survey that's ever been done in healthcare field shows that over 60% of the doctors, nurses, and technicians aren't going to report to work if there's a communicable illness outbreak. So if you don't have a communicable illness plan in your company, that's going to change your ability to perform at that point in time, further exacerbating this time issue. Workplace violence, again, changes what's occurring, and those types of situations immediately leap out and change the perception of the company as well as the impact associated with it. Now, most of us aren't going to be faced with an armed intruder within our individual business, but if you look at the impact associated with that, there are 2 million episodes of workplace violence annually in the United States. 2 million episodes. When you start listing those numbers, think about how many that would be every single day that's occurring somewhere. Think about the times that you've seen the news, looked at it online, or watched the evening newscast or the morning television show associated with it. And those are going to be lead stories where something has occurred, and it's from this standpoint. OSHA has identified workplace violence as an identified hazard, and you then have to have a plan in place to deal with it. So think about those in addition to the business continuity. So I want you to look at this list and do a mental checklist for you right now on your plan. These are the key criteria. Does your plan align to best practices? Is it available 24/7 to everyone? Is it comprehensive? Does it cover all vulnerabilities and threats, all scenarios? Is it based upon continuous improvement? In fact, we would prefer you to call it a program as opposed to a plan, because a plan sounds like it's more finite and ending. This has to become a part of your culture and who you are. I'll talk more about continuous improvement in just a minute. It has to be cost effective. You're not going to pay $1 million to solve a $10,000 problem. So let's look at what steps you can take within your budget. it is never acceptable to say, we don't have a budget, we don't have the money, so we're not going to do anything. There are things that anyone can do that will make a significant difference in the impacts in areas. It has to be cultural preparedness within your business. Everybody has to understand, and that becomes a theme. Having a plan at home, by the way, is a building block of a plan at work. If you don't have a plan at home, you can go to the Firestorm website and download Disaster Ready People for Disaster Ready America, and that will be focused on helping you build a plan at home, and your employees should do exactly the same thing. Because if you don't, you're forcing them at the time that it's most critical of whether they're going to choose their family over their job, and family always trumps job. So from a time standpoint, that's a quick area that you can carry forward. Is your plan current? Is it out of date? And pretty much if it's on paper, your plan is not current. Has to be easy to deploy, has to be exercised. It needs to be expert and actionable. It needs to show people how to do whatever it is that they're going to do, and just not what to do. That's the largest failure that we see repeated from one company to another. And as we've talked about, it's got to be not just a binder on a shelf. It's got to become a part of the culture. It has to be available via the cloud. It has to be virtual at all times and clearly trained. Now, continuous improvement partnership is really where you want to start to establish that. And I think the Rochester Business Alliance and the introduction that Chip gave is a good example of how they want to help be a partner with you to accomplish that. And certainly Firestorm would like to be a partner with you to do those things too. But preparedness must be continuous. It's not, hey, once and done and we're in and out of here. You've got to be able to look at all the vulnerabilities and not just a single threat. So we don't want to just focus on that armed intruder. We want to look at all the elements that could occur. And it is a responsibility of governance here. If you're a public or a private company or an organization and you have a board, it's a board responsibility. We're seeing this increasingly fall under the audit committee of the board. In the Big Four accounting firms now are requiring that you have a board member who focuses on risk and carrying forward. And this whole area comes back to that word oversight that we talked about. There's specific responsibilities, again, for oversight of management in this process. There should be motions passed by your board directing management to put these plans in place, and there needs to be reporting back to the board associated with it, because that's the only way that you're going to be sure that you have everything in place at the time that you need to have it. And it really takes continual vigilance in the process. And you've got to follow the best practices and standards. You know, if the best practice came out of the mining industry and you're a bank, still do what they're doing. Maybe they have blazed the area in that. You may find somebody who's in the distribution business has a better handle on the communications requirements and practices. And there are international standards now in these areas, and sharing those would become apparent. So one of the things, if you haven't taken advantage of it, is underwritten by the Rochester Business Alliance, is the ability to get an assessment of where your plans are now. The questions that you see here is a reason for you to measure your plans relative to standards and best practices. So you want to know the answers to these questions, not only then to get the absolute rating on your company as a percentage of best practices, but a benchmark. Where are you relative to other companies in your area, in your industry, in your size, as you're going forward? Because that will help to clarify for senior management and the board from a governance perspective. So why measure? It's so that when we ask a question like, are you prepared, are you ready, then you'll know you're sure. And the way you'll know that and how you'll know that is the fact that you have had that assessment in place. The no-fee assessment is a $2,500 value. The cost of that is underwritten by the Rochester Business Alliance. If you'd like to have that, you can contact Firestorm, mention the Rochester Business Alliance, and the fee will be waived. We'll try to reach out to the people on the call today and share that information. So if you wanted to summarize how we're going to manage the time in these types of areas, it's follow the PREDICT plan PLAN.PERFORM process. What are the vulnerabilities? What are the threats? How are you going to implement those plans? What are the impacts? What are the triggers that activate them? Having that clearly identified will save you time at the time when it matters the most. So that's what our focus has been today, to talk about that and to give you that framework. Now, as we look ahead, we wanted to thank the Rochester Business Alliance and Chip today for serving as our moderator and introducing the topics as we've gone forward. And I think this is a key value for your membership at the Rochester Business Alliance, is understanding that they're here to work with you in this partnership relationship. This has been part of the Crisis Coach webinar series that we're jointly presenting with the Rochester Business Alliance. You can go to Firestorm.com and view past webinars and register for future webinars. We'll be coming out in the next couple of weeks with the editorial calendar for 2014 and posting those topics and dates, but we'll pick back up after the holidays and put that schedule out so that you can plan and share. If you would like to review some of the things we've talked about today or in earlier webinars, you can again go to Firestorm.com, or you can direct others within your organization to go and look at that. One of the other things to consider, since supply chain failure is the largest failure in a disaster or crisis, you might want to be talking with your critical vendors about watching the webinar series also and having them share with you where they are and what they're doing. So if you've got questions, reach out to us at webinars@firestorm.com or give us a call. Or if you would like to have a webinar like you've seen today or on other topics, let us know and we'd be glad to arrange to make that available to you. I think we've used up our time today, so I'd like to wish everyone a Merry Christmas and Happy Holidays to you and your family at this very special time of year. And this is a time when it matters most. So every crisis is a human crisis. So as you're going through the holidays and you're thinking about your family, your company, your business, your community, are you ready? How do you know? And are you sure? Thanks, everyone. Have a great day. Jim Satterfield, Firestorm. We'll be looking forward to our conversations in the new year. Thanks, everyone. That concludes today's webinar. Goodbye.
Bye.